Good afternoon and welcome to everybody. So this presentation is emergency response within your community. And our overall goal today is to talk to you a little bit about what you can expect from the responders that are coming into your community to address urgent or unexpected threats. So who am I? I'm Mike Towle. I manage the emergency response program here at EPA Region 3. I'm going to sort of MC this presentation for you. So emergency response is typically a very high impact and very short duration event, and you'll normally see large amounts of resources, very specialized equipment and specialized resources. It can be invasive. It can be concerning. But we're here to kind of talk to you a little bit about that, and hopefully you'll come away with that. It's also very organized. What we do is organize. We're trying to bring a little organization to what is largely an unexpected and somewhat chaotic event, because all response starts locally. And the big ones involve multiple levels of government. We thought it would be best to have representatives of both local and state level governments with me today to talk to you about emergency response within your community. So locally, we'll have Mr. Joel Landis from Somerset County, PA. From the state, we'll have Mr. John Giese representing the state of Virginia. And you'll get me to talk to you about federal level response here at EPA. There'll be 3 quick presentations. We hope to, again, convey a sense of structure, a sense of experience, a sense of capability to you. And hopefully you also come away with our goal to also keep a community informed. We believe that an informed community, and in fact, an engaged community, will make all of this go a whole lot better. So part of our presentation will be how we are going to, or how we try to keep a community informed during a response and keep a community engaged about the response. We'll leave some time at the end to further interact with you in case you have comments or questions. And I greatly appreciate, and in fact, we greatly appreciate you coming to this presentation. And with that, I'll kick it over to Joel, and he can further introduce himself and talk to you about emergency response at the local level. Joel.
All right. Thank you, Michael. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Is that displaying for everybody? Okay, good. All right, thank you. All right. I just want to express my gratitude for Michael for inviting me to this presentation today. I think that maybe this is some government repayback from the county to the federal level for assisting Somerset County on not only this incident that I'm going to talk about on the local level, but many more that occurred here. So again, I truly appreciate the honor of being able to represent local emergency services on a federal level during this conference. So there's a picture of me on the left. That's just a couple years ago. So that's when I started. I give you a little bit of background. I'm Joel Landis. I'm the Director of Emergency Services for Somerset County, Pennsylvania. That I'm roughly 20 years old, probably in that photo on the left, donning a hazmat suit. I started off in the fire service, EMS service very early on. I was able to start off as a volunteer, and then was hired by the county at a very early age as a 911 dispatcher. Our Department of Emergency Services then encompassed a 2-person emergency management office and a call center. But I was also a volunteer firefighter, and I moonlighted as an EMT and eventually became a manager of an ambulance station, all while I was working for the county. I was a 911 dispatcher for 7 years, and then I became a 911 shift supervisor for 5 years. During that tenure, several large events occurred. Flight 93, one of the 9/11 sites, is located here in Somerset County. The year after that, in 2002, the Q Creek mine rescue, where 9 miners were rescued, also occurred in this small rural county of roughly about 70,000 folks that are here. After 2001, the Department of Homeland Security was spun up. Regional task forces were formed all across the country, and I was able to be on a more of an administrative role starting in the year 2011. In that year, the county oversaw the administration of the county hazardous materials response team. However, I was still networked in with that Department of Homeland Security annex at the time, preparing for incidents on the home front. I can say, looking back to 2011 and even further a little bit back, fortunately, some of those things that we trained and prepared for never came, but the threat is obviously still real, and we learned a lot from September 11th. I think networking, knowing state and federal agencies were all things that we enhanced going forward, and I attribute that to the EPA as well, with responses such as the one I'm going to talk about here next. So I played that role out, by the way, from 2011 up until 2018, and now I'm the director here. So I've worked every role right up to this role. Our emergency management office is a little bit bigger, not significantly bigger than when I started, but we have added at least one position there. And then 911 is completely different. It was paper and pencil, one computer. There's 6 screens, multiple things all occurring now than when I started there. We still maintain that county hazardous materials response team. We just recertified Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Has a pretty robust process for the hazardous materials response teams, and you have to go through a series of obligations to be certified. So that's kudos to our team for going through that process under a new directive. We also have a county water rescue team. We have a county animal response team. We have a search and rescue team. So we have several specialized teams, and those specialized teams are they're ready to support the local fire, police, and EMS. Pennsylvania is a Commonwealth. So those that are from Commonwealths know that local form roles, so that's a little different than a state. The local municipalities identify the fire, police, and EMS. Somerset County has 25 boroughs and 25 townships, and roughly a population of about 70,000. And again, we just happen to be, fortunately, unfortunately, a host of some disasters. I would say that the fortunate side is the experience to know firsthand how important it is to have those connections and know some of those processes ahead of an incident. And I've involved my whole career around that. I was in my early 20s when September 11th occurred, and for all of you that are on the call that work through that event in different capacities, I think that all of us brought home with us through that event that we needed to make some differences or make some changes and differences in our processes. And one of those is being able to know each other. So my disclaimer on what I'm going to talk about next is I'm going to pull apart one local level incident and sort of talk about how that looks like on the local level. Now, the disclaimer is this is all me. This has nothing to do with Somerset County, has nothing to do with the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania or the federal government. So, this is all on me. I'm going to try to do my best not to pull out a lot of details about the facility, because it's an event that occurred several years ago. And I think it's fair to them that, something bad happened at their facility. But again, there is everything I'm going to talk about today is open source. You can go to the EPA's website and pull the whole file deck. So there's nothing that this facility should have to worry about. So this is a large commercial facility located in Somerset County. Again, back to the small rural type of atmosphere. We don't have a very robust zoning and coding enforcement, mainly because, you know, part of that being a smaller populated area, and the fact that we're a commonwealth where, you know, that's not a system that's maintained on the state level. It's up to the local government down to the municipal level. So this facility is roughly located and surrounded by a residential area. It kind of looks out of place if you would see it. There's just houses all around it, very little access to it, but it's a very, very large commercial building. Our agency was notified that they thought there was a potential methamphetamine lab inside. So I just happened to be at training. Emergency managers have to do a required series of training, and I can remember receiving the call from the local police department that was called to this incident or to this location because the bank had happened to be there assessing it. The company had went bankrupt and left the facility, I want to say several years ago, and had sort of back and forth activity up until the point where the bank had to come in and assess it. And when they did, they thought there was a methamphetamine lab. They had saw that the door was forced open and called the police. So when I received the call, Pennsylvania has, again, just speaking on behalf of how local responses work, Pennsylvania has a state police clandestine response team. Specialized team, that's all they deal with. And honestly, from the local hazmat level, that was perfect. We will assist law enforcement, but evidence collection, et cetera, when we have a clandestine lab is vitally important. So that team came out while I was at the training. So I was able to call them, they were able to go. And it was not a clandestine. It was a large commercial building that had not seen anybody in, like, again, roughly a year, but had been left intact. And later on, we find out that really, one day in the week, the company owner came along and said, we're done. And everybody sort of walked away and just left it sit for some time. So that's kind of like the view that you're seeing right now is just coming into that and seeing a big commercial building. That there's no clandestine lab, but there's chemicals involved in it. So here's a good picture of what it looks like with all the residences around. And as you can see, there's one gas station there to your left. However, very large facility. To the right, you'll see what looks like a rural area, but that's sort of wetlands, and it doesn't really give you an idea of that. But so to the right is some wetlands, and to the left is a main highway with a gas station. However, it's just surrounded with these houses. Now, this mobile home court to the south of the facility, we had some issues there as well, where there was multiple abandoned trailers. And on about a weekly occurrence, we were having arson fires. So I'm trying to paint the picture for you. We got called to this facility, thought it was a methamphetamine lab. No, it's an industrial facility full of chemicals. And we also have this arsonist that's kind of moving around this mobile home court at the same time. So all of this is kind of like in the back of our minds. To put a date on it, 2016. So here it is, 2023. So much has happened in life since then, but I can still describe this whole scene. So that shows you that wetlands. I know that this comes into play a little bit, but it's definitely in that floodplain just to begin with. So just just want to throw that out there as well. So this is where I met Michael. Let me get back to this. So how this works on the local level is we arrived there. We found some items that overshot our capacity. We have huge vats of chemicals. We have an active lab. The facility itself produced a material that it's called ionic cellulose gum. And I had no clue what that was, right? So a lot of times when we go out, there's just these trade names and things that we don't know, but it ends up, it's the material that they put in diapers. So in like 2016, if you can think, I don't know what diapers look like now. I have a teenager, so maybe diapers have changed, right? But they had like that foam material that was in it. And it was a pretty significant specialty. Like there was only so many places in the United States that made this, and it happens that Somerset County got to be one of them. So I got to learn all about that. But this is sort of what it looked like without the lights. Like to peer in at the facility, it looked like this. There was lots of water. You can see to the right, like a big, huge tank, and there's you can see on the right there's placards 1824, an acid. There's a lab on the left. So we backed out and we said, well, this has been sitting here, and we did a 360-degree of the facility. We walk around looking for additional hazards. We immediately informed the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection and the EPA that this is here, and we have significant contamination at certain parts, and we need help. And I would attribute that the EPA and the on-scene coordinators, they've come out since way back in 2011 when I said that the county hazmat team was reformed. We would bring them in every year to conduct training for our hazmat team members. So we had a great connection, and that's free of charge, by the way. The EPA doesn't charge the counties for that. They bring in people to train us. So we were all on the same page to begin with. Pennsylvania DEP also has an emergency response program. They have people assigned to come out and respond to incidents like this. So we all formalized a plan to come out as one and do an official site survey. And, that involved personal protective gear and being able to identify some of the chemicals and hazards that were there, and really get sort of a solid game plan together on how we're going to rectify this and make it safe for the community. Again, I talk about the arsonist. We found signs of fire in the facility at one point, and we were trying to track that. And I can only imagine if we would have had a fire at this facility. As you can see, these are super totes of that material that I talked about that was placed in the diapers. I can't imagine if we found it quick enough, and it was remediated before any of that would happen. There were several site issues with this. It was a very unsafe scene. The complete roof and substructure was compromised. It was a very wet summer too. 2016, a lot of rain. You can see there's standing water in the facility. As we did the 360, I came across this personally. I could smell, I was, the EPA and DP it inserted teams inside, and I remember walking around and I smelled mercaptan. Mercaptan's what they add to natural gas to give that rotten egg odor and smell, so it's there. And this is a natural gas regulator station. It definitely was connected to the facility, but as you can see, there's a mobile home on the right. It was part of their gas system. And this is completely opposite. This is a local level response. So as you're at one big hazard, you find another. And that's exactly what we found. I smelled the mercaptan. I walked over, and here was a regulator station that at some point had a tree snap off and penetrate the roof and was into the valving. And I had to call the gas company and they came, and we kind of thought you would think that somebody would have saw that a while back, but they didn't. So again, you find one hazard, you find another, and that's local level, day in and day out. That's going to happen. So back to the facility, EPA quickly identified that this would be a Superfund site, and that they would roll out assets to assist the county, and be able to mitigate this. And when they did, job trailers arrived, and on-sea coordinators arrived, and all kinds of chemists arrived. Again, looking back on this incident, I'm kind of all still to this day, the amount of people and resources it taken. In collaboration, though, I can remember the work site as they were remediating it. We had this issue in 2016 with rain. It was so wet in Pennsylvania. And at one point they said that, we gotta keep stopping the operation, we gotta keep stopping because of this rain. And, being a firefighter, I remember these in the center picture, these water diverters. And this is something you would use when like a firefighter, ventilates a building. They cut a hole in that roof, and then they put the fire out, but yet, you need to patch the roof. And this is one thing that you could purchase to remediate that. But we found that we could utilize that in this facility during the cleanup to be able to prevent that water hazard that kept occurring with all the rain. So that was it's just one of those local to the federal assets. We all have this unified command where we're all in the job office together. And I said, I think I got an idea, and that's how the whole summer played out. There'd be a question, we would find an answer. There was underground storage tanks, so we had to pull in DEP with the permits and the local municipality about water feed connections, and we did that all summer long. Again, a very unique situation with some of the chemicals. I won't go into detail and bore you with all of them, but that acid container had a very unique acid. I'll put it that way. It was very specific to the product they were making, and it required a fair amount of research. You can see that they cut the tank out to be able to recover all of that acid into a truck. So just a lot of moving parts. There was a large incubator machine inside of the factory. I don't believe I have a real good picture of what it looked like, but it had started to leak into the ground. And you can see there on the right, that's a photo of the ground contamination. And they had already excavated out the concrete, but there was a thermo reaction with the chemical and the soil. This is where the chemist comes into play, of taking the soil content and looking at its properties, and then looking at the chemical and saying, well, what just happened here? It had concrete heaved up into the air several feet from that reaction, just to give you an idea of how bad this really is. And again, here's some of the assets: the acid tankers, the acid totes. This is all Superfund EPA bringing assets in to immediately rectify this situation. All these documents, again, they're available online. You can search this whole incident, and I only had 20 minutes to talk about it, so I've tried to capture what it looks like. It still stands today. The factory is still there, the building's still there, so the bank has it, but it's free of all chemicals. So there's no concerns of that. And again, to the EPA's point, if we wouldn't have brought in that federal asset and tapped into these federal programs, I don't know what the outcome would have been. So with that, I will turn it over to Michael or John next, but I will be around for any questions as well. Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon, folks. I'm tell you a little bit about myself. I am the manager of DEQ's Office of Pollution Response and Emergency Preparedness. I'm a former Navy brat who, like most military and military dependents, moved from place to place every few years. That being said, I consider myself a Virginia native because that's where my family spent the most time, and it's where I went to college, go Hokies, and where I've lived now for the past 26 plus years. I joined the DEQ in 1997 and started in their petroleum storage tank program. And at that time, the office in which the storage tank program is located also had the pollution response program. I eventually became the manager for petroleum remediation and the pollution response program. And as pollution response and emergency preparedness functions grew, those functions were eventually carved out to form the new Office of Pollution Response and Emergency Preparedness, and I manage that office. One of the most important functions in my position is to serve as the state on-scene coordinator for significant pollution incidents. And I have served in that capacity for several high-level incidents, the Duke Energy coal ash spill, several pipeline releases, liquid hazardous pipeline releases, the Oceana jet fuel spill, which I'm going to talk about in my presentation. But enough about me, and let's get back to emergency response. So Joel gave a great presentation about a response to a very bad situation. But before we explore how state and federal agencies fold into local responses, we should consider that there was that's my disclaimer as well, a before time. And at a time when all there was were localities and their firefighters. And when we think about it, firefighters, what they did was they put the wet stuff on the red stuff. And that's their terminology. So if it could harm the public, they put water on it. Well, that extended on into the future and for some time to spilled materials. And I can recall conversations with older DEQ staff when I first started that was an issue, at least in the pollution response world, where we had to work to instruct the responders not to wash down spilled materials. So as Joel's presentation showed, we've come a long way. Now we have specialized teams who are able to respond to hazardous materials and to contain those materials, stabilize spills until contractors can be brought in to conduct a cleanup or removal. And the locality, states, and federal agencies have specialized hazmat teams that can be mobilized for these events. When I speak with the public, friends, and family and coworkers, they're often surprised at the amount of planning entities that exist and the amount of resources that are available to and ready to respond to routine and significant pollution incidents. So I'm going to speak to this in just a minute, but before I do, it helps to understand how we got there. So we're going to take a journey back in time, and for me, this journey never ceases to both fascinate me and to concern me at the same time. The major environmental laws and regs that speak to emergency planning and response were unfortunately born from environmental disasters. And the disasters I'm going to share were not necessarily singular catalysts for statutory and regulatory change, but they're often held up as significant catalysts. So first, we'll start with the crude oil tanker Torrey Canyon that ran aground off the southern tip of Great Britain in 1967. The US watched with great concern, maybe even horror, as forces of the British government responded and mostly failed to address an oil spill that eventually impacted southern Great Britain, the Isle of Guernsey, and the coastline of Brittany and France. Next up, Cuyahoga River fire in 1969. Chronologically, the image that I just put up depicts an earlier fire on the Cuyahoga River, but suffice it to say that the river burned on several occasions due to the amount of waste and oily waste being dumped into the river. Now we move on to New York State in an aerial image of Love Canal. Love Canal had been dug in the late 1800s as part of a plan to expand hydroelectric power, but the project was never completed. Moved forward in time, and the Hooker Chemical Company acquired the canal to use it in the 1940s and 50s as a landfill for disposal of hazardous wastes. All of this preceded the construction of a school and neighborhood over and adjacent to the canal, and in the 1970s, buried hazardous waste began to surface. In December of '84, highly toxic methyl isocyanate used to manufacture pesticides leaked from the Union Carbide plant in Bhopal, India, and entered surrounding neighborhoods. This resulted in thousands of deaths and hundreds of thousands of injuries. March 24th, 1989, the single-hulled oil tanker Exxon Valdez ran aground on Bligh Reef in Prince William Sound off Alaska. This resulted in the tanker spilling somewhere between 10 and 30 million gallons of crude oil. The scale of the impacts was enormous. And last up, January 9th, 2014, 4-methyl cyclohexane methanol, or MCHM, a material used to clean impurities from coal, leaked from a storage tank at Freedom Industries facility along the Elk River in West Virginia and into the river. The now contaminated water of the Elk River flowed into the Kanawha River, eventually impacting a major drinking water intake belonging to West Virginia American Water. Some 300,000 residents in surrounding communities were eventually without water, including the West Virginia legislature that had just come into session. So then came the environmental statutes and regulation. Torrey Canyon brought us the National Contingency Plan. The Cuyahoga River fire, or more correctly, fires, brought us the Clean Water Act. Love Canal brought us the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, or more easily said, CERCLA, or Superfund. The Bhopal India incident ushered in the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, or EPCRA. This one signifies for localities, as I'll explain in a minute. Exxon Valdez gave us the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, or OPA 90, which updated the Clean Water Act. And lastly, the Elk River incident resulted in an amendment to EPCRA via the American Water Infrastructure Act. I've grouped the National Contingency Plan, Clean Water Act, and OPA 90 together because they're all related. The National Contingency Plan, or NCP, started as a national plan for responding to major oil spills, such as the Torrey Canyon, and it indeed was just a plan at the time, not a regulation. It wasn't codified until the passage of the Clean Water Act, which is why it included it. And the plan was later expanded to include hazardous substance releases. At a very high level, the plan spells out roles and responsibilities, and it establishes required plans and planning bodies, and it speaks to the required exercises, and it establishes response priorities and phases of response. I've included CERCLA, not just because it establishes prohibitions and requirements for haz waste sites, but mainly because it established the funding mechanism and provided for the removals of haz waste. And Mike, I know I'm stealing some EPA thunder here, but as a state, I think we need to understand the world of the localities and the feds very thoroughly. Next up is the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, or EPCRA. This piece of legislation requires the establishment of state emergency response commissions and local emergency planning committees, or LEPCs. It requires the LEPCs to develop chemical emergency response plans for their jurisdictions, requires notifications for releases of certain hazardous chemicals above specified thresholds, requires facilities to share key information concerning the hazardous chemicals that they store. And once amended by the American Water Infrastructure Act, EPCRA requires state emergency response commissions to notify drinking water primacy agencies of discharges that occur in source water protection zones of drinking water sources. And those drinking water primacy agencies are then required to share the information with operators of potentially affected community water systems. So then the planning entities, though not discussed, there is a whole host of statutes and regulations which require emergency planning at facility levels or for owners and operators of various modes of transportation. So I felt we should include it here. Next up on this list, we have the LEPC, or local emergency planning committees, that I just spoke about. Those are the lowest level planning entities. And as we move up, we have state departments of emergency management who work with supporting agencies to develop state emergency operations plans and annexes. Next come the inland and coastal area committees, which are chaired by the EPA and US Coast Guard respectively. And the area committees are required under the National Contingency Plan, and the requirement for their existence is owed to the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. Within Virginia, the Coastal Area Committee meets quarterly. In fact, they're meeting right now as I speak in Virginia Beach, and I'd be there, except I'm here today presenting to you. Second from the top, we have regional response teams, also required under the NCP, where the region corresponds to EPA regions. And then within EPA Region 3, we meet semi-annually. The most recent meeting just took place the first week of May in Maryland. And finally, at the top, we have the National Response Team. And the function of each planning entity is ultimately to evaluate and update their respective plans. And this is accomplished by meeting periodically to discuss incidents, exercises, lessons learned, and emerging topics of interest to the response community. So this graphic illustrates that family of plans running from the lowest level up to the National Contingency Plan, And again, down at the very bottom, there could be additional plans for transportation modes as well. I saw that Mike is going to speak to this a little bit later, but I'm going to pause and just make mention of Stafford Act versus NCP responses, or National Contingency Plan responses. I won't do a deep dive, however, thought important because for many, the word disaster conjures up the acronym FEMA, which, the disaster agency. And if a pollution incident is large enough and has far-reaching impacts, the media and the public would easily call it a disaster, and thus the public might think FEMA. But its National Contingency Plan response is how we approach oil and hazardous material spills. All right, so everything I've shared thus far was to illustrate that there is a ton that goes on behind the scenes and in between pollution incidents. Everything that happens or that should happen in the wake of a pollution incident should be informed in some way by efforts of these planning entities and the plans they've developed and maintained. So now on to emergency response and how states fold in. This graphic is conceptual to illustrate the relationship between the size of an incident and the amount of time or resources that have to be devoted to the incident. And you'll note on the right-hand side of the illustration the graphic is an illustration of when local, state, and federal resources might need to be engaged in an incident. And at the lowest level, or a type 5 incident, and that comes from ICS, or Incident Command System terminology, local resources are all that are needed, and the incident's resolved typically within 24 hours. At the highest level, or a type 1 incident, significant local, state, and federal resources might need to be brought to bear to respond to and manage the incident. Most incidents are type 4 and 5 incidents. A type 5 incident would be your average tractor trailer accident that unfortunately happens almost every day, at least it does here in Virginia. An example of a type 1 incident would be the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And I should note that state and federal involvement is not necessarily constrained to a need for resources, but rather there could be state or federal jurisdiction and a required compliance or enforcement action. So we can get involved on the small stuff as well. Incident management. So pictured here is the April 2014 CSX crude oil train derailment in Lynchburg, Virginia. And it's the backdrop for a host of considerations that the local and state on-scene coordinator and also the federal on-scene coordinator must consider to be and be prepared to manage, with the assistance, of course, in the wake of a significant incident. The on-scene coordinators, after assessing an incident, will make additional notifications and begin pulling in, assisting, and supporting agencies and their resources. So we have not only the response, but there's obviously public information. There are public health impacts that have to be considered, and we bring in our departments of health. Community concerns, always there. There's critical infrastructure, so we talk about downstream water intakes and natural resources, so beyond the people. I like to say it's the fins, the fur, and feathers that we have to consider. And then special interests can come into play. So there is a process, excuse me, for getting resources to incidents. And this is a bit of a busy graphic, but it generally depicts that requests for resources flow up from an incident and a locality to the state level, and then possibly from a state level up to the federal level. And this graphic also depicts how localities can seek assistance from neighboring localities through mutual aid agreements. And there's a similar construct at the state level, which provides for state-to-state mutual aid through what are called emergency management assistance compacts. The takeaway here is that there are mechanisms and constructs in place to facilitate the sharing of resources and for making those requests and getting them filled. All right, one of my favorite things to talk about, and that is incident management versus event management. My paradigm, and it's not just my own, but I speak about this often, is that for emergency response, there is the incident, which consists of the oil and hazmat release and the required response and recovery. And then there's the event, which is everything to do with people, press, and politics. And as depicted here on the slide, you can have a big incident that may have an associated small event, or the converse. A small incident which is the small incident with a big event. And I place greater importance on management of the event And I always say this because the yuck, the oil of the hazmat, does not talk back, but people do. And if you're not well positioned to manage the event for the people, the press, and the politics portion, your response can be rather painful. Okay, community engagement. A professional colleague and a former NOAA scientific support coordinator has described historic community engagement like this. She would say, when a pollution incident occurs requiring an emergency response by multiple levels of government and multiple agencies, all of the response entities would come together and we'd all jump in our response black box. And the only communication that we would have with the public would be one-way communication in the form of press releases or media engagements. And what was lacking was meaningful two-way engagement with affected or potentially affected communities. Because as this graphic shows, as soon as an incident occurs and we spread the information through those, well, in today's world, social media, press releases, different posts, could be emails, news articles. We obviously trigger questions and concerns by the community, the affected or potentially affected communities. So there's now in this world, in today's world, fortunately, a larger focus on that two-way communications. It's a challenge, but it's absolutely worth it in the end. We reap great benefits as responders when we pay attention to this. And to that, in addition to typical information sharing pipelines that I've mentioned, Virginia's had recent success in standing up incident-specific web pages where there's been intense interest in an incident, and the public and the media can come to this web page for up-to-date information on the incident and answers to frequently asked questions and for key contact information. It's a practice that's worked well. We've gotten great feedback, and we plan to continue this for future pollution incidents that result in significant interest by the people, press, or the politics. So how about now for some incidents? Up first is an illicit dumping incident that impacted two localities. Shortly after receiving a report of a single dumping location behind a shopping center, DEQ received two additional reports of illicit dumping in a neighborhood. Both the locality and the state conducted screenings of the materials and concluded that the materials were not hazardous, but for one container. And given the locations in the neighborhoods, DEQ moved to hire a contractor to begin cleanup of the identified sites. Well, over the course of the next 3 days, 10 additional sites would be identified, many of which were in residential areas. The two affected localities took the lead in investigating the dumping, and a criminal investigation is currently underway. So I'm not really going to give many details other than to show you these images. In this instance, the state was able to assist the localities with cleanup of the dump sites. Had these materials all been hazardous waste, the state would likely have requested assistance from the EPA. And as you can see from the picture on the top right, these were rather alarming images, and the public was sharing those among each other and also with us. And so timely cleanup was key. The other incident I will talk about is the Oceana jet fuel spill. So May of 2017, U.S. Navy's Oceana Master Jet Base, pictured here on the right-hand side of this image, was receiving a shipment of jet fuel via pipeline. The fuel was to be delivered to their bulk fuel storage tanks, which are circled in red toward the bottom of the image, but due to a valve misalignment and lack of personnel monitoring the fuel delivery, approximately 97,000 gallons of jet fuel was spilled to the ground, and it made its way into drainage features that ultimately discharged into Wolfsnare Creek, which is a tributary to the Lynnhaven Inlet. You can see the red line traced from the circled area through a farm field and then along a ditch line of a major road in Virginia Beach that ultimately intersected a creek. That creek ran through the neighborhood at the top left of the image and then on into Lynnhaven Inlet. The local response was rapid, and together with state hazmat team resources, prevented the fuel from spreading further into Lynnhaven Inlet. And Pictured here are some local response, which is on the right. The biggest underflow dam I've ever seen constructed. That was worked by the city of Virginia Beach, top notch. On the bottom left is a mobile command post that was provided by the Virginia Port Authority. And then in the center picture, you can see the response materials in the form of oil boom and sorbent sweep that's been deployed out in the water where the creek entered Lynnhaven Inlet. Given the size of the release and the fact that it impacted navigable waters, both state and federal personnel responded almost at the same time and began bringing in resources. So here's an image of cleanup crews working there at the impacted creek and showing the oil boom strung across that finger of the Lynnhaven Inlet. Also here, that's an image of the incident command post, and specifically a unified command meeting with members of the command staff to talk about the incident action plan and response progress. Here's a warehouse that was obtained, if you will, for setting up the rest of the incident command post, and we have lots of Coast Guard and state personnel working together, along with locality personnel for the response. And then the last image I'll share is in terms of community participation. This was a meeting that was set up. It's a cafeteria style public meeting that was set up in a local school. And so we have different stations set up around the outside of the gymnasium there with subject matter experts from different areas. And so the public was able to come in and visit the different stations and ask questions of those subject matter experts. One interesting note I mentioned earlier, but the planning entities that meet on a regular basis, and so specifically the regional response team, was actually meeting at the time that this incident occurred. And as we sat around the meeting table and everybody started looking at their phones and showing their phones to each other, we realized that this release had occurred, and everybody shortly thereafter got up, grabbed their stuff, and started heading to vehicles and began driving south. The meeting was in Maryland, so we all started driving down to Virginia Beach. With that, I guess we're gonna postpone questions, but I'll stop there, and I'm going to pass it on to Mike Towle to bring us home.
So once again, I am Mike Towle, and Dylan, please let me know that this is now working correctly. I've been in this business since 1987. 25 years of that has been as one of EPA's on-scene coordinators. And since 2018 now, as I mentioned earlier, I've been managing the regional response program here. I'm very, very, very grateful to Joel and to John for their presentations. And a significant takeaway from Joel was that these emergency responses are usually very impactful locally. And John also showed some images of the same type of thing. And one thing that John was imparting was that, and Joel mentioned as well, was that we usually do this and we have a plan and we have procedures, there's processes in place, and we have groups that meet on a routine basis to try to make sure that we're doing this in a way that is helpful for the response. So here's what I'm going to try to do through my presentation. It's going to be very simple. I'm going to talk at the federal level, the types of things that we do and the resources that we bring. I'm going to try to highlight, as my partners did here, the fact that a lot of this is done in a coordinated and organized way. And I'll try to bring it home at the end with the discussion about the community interaction that we'd like to have that John touched upon. And although I use the local, state, and federal here, I would be remiss if I didn't also highlight that in Region 3, we have tribal entities now. So it's more than just us. And we're very happy to have started, and hopefully we'll continue to assist and engage with our newest partners, who actually are representing probably our longest tenured communities. So here we go with my presentation. So the Dylan, could you let me know which slide is being shown right now? Does it say Stafford Act?
Right now, it's the Stafford Act, yes.
Thank you. So from the federal point of view, there are really, and John highlighted this as well, there are really two key modes or categories of things that we do. One is under the auspices of the Stafford Act. These are the natural disasters. Everybody thinks FEMA, but it's more than FEMA. The other style I'll get into in just a second here. But FEMA, these are very impactful when this occurs. The most common one in Region 3 here relates to flooding events. You can imagine that a community that's flooded is a significantly impacted community. These are notably sort of large, but they're not all natural disasters. And clearly, the September 11th events were a sort of a man-made disaster. So, but these are big events. What you might see from EPA on this is EPA being assigned, or we're working for FEMA and the states, and we might bring in resources to collect household hazardous waste, for example, that have gotten away during the course of a flood. So the other type of response would be a response that is under the national response system. And hopefully your slides, you'll either see something related to hazardous substances or oil at the time. When these release out into a community, they can be very impactful, right? John mentioned the Bhopal, India, for example. If that released somewhere in your community, that would be very impactful. Dylan, could you let me know which slide is showing? Somehow I've lost track of that.
Right now, we're still on Stafford Act.
All right, so I have to learn how to change the slides.
Or you just let me know what slide to be on.
If you could advance, I'd appreciate it.
Can do.
Thank you. So John mentioned the CERCLA. So when we respond to a hazardous substance release, the images shown here, the one on the left is a lab right in the middle of a neighborhood, similar to Joel's Penn Carbo site, but this was actually a home. This was somebody's home that was full of chemicals, and this response started locally. It advanced to include the state and advanced further yet to include EPA resources. I don't think that many communities would expect their local fire department to dispose of literally thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds of chemicals from a house. The image on the right is more what we think about when we're talking about a response affecting your community, like the Penn Carbos example that Joel talked about. Here is an example of an abandoned factory right across the street. So you can imagine that if this was once maybe a job producer and safely operated, once it gets abandoned and just left to its own, that becomes quite the concern for a community. So Dylan, if you could advance the slide. And when we respond on the national response system, and it's not a hazardous substance, it's an oil, and about half of the work in Region 3 relates to a petroleum or oil spill. I chose these two pictures because you can think about it in this way. These can occur remotely, but there's still a community, right? It may be far fewer people, but there's still a community, or it can concur right smack in the middle of one of our urban centers. John showed the train derailment in Lynchburg, and this is an oil spill on the Schuylkill River here in Philadelphia. So, and with an oil spill, it's really not just oil. The gasoline is also oil, which delivers vapors into the air. So if you're a resident right near one of these things, you can imagine that this incident will be impactful to you. And when we respond to these things, whether it's my example of the lab in the community or this oil spill in the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia, we try to get the person or company responsible to do the work. That kind of makes sense, right? But we often don't know who they are right out of the gate. So we want to work to try to find them simultaneously with trying to mitigate the hazards and abate the threats. So we're not going to hold up doing a responsible action until we find somebody. But when we find that person or that company, we will be sure to let them know that they are the polluter and it's time to pay. Dylan, if you could advance the slide, I'd appreciate it. So how does EPA do this? So here's just a basic overview of how EPA responds. We have in our very small group, we have duty officers, and they answer a spill line on a continual basis. There's always somebody who will answer the phone. There's a national number. It's been around for quite some time. When you call that number, somebody from the U.S. Coast Guard's National Response Center will pick that up, and they will transfer that information to one of our on-scene coordinator duty officers on a 24/7, 365. And they have the authority at all times to dispatch. You heard the term before, an on-scene coordinator. They are the heart of our program. They are who we all rely on at the federal level to basically go to an incident, size it up, figure out what the needs are, and to bring those resources to that incident as quickly as possible. But they're also charged with staying around for the longer term, right? Some of these things, we mentioned disposal, or I mentioned disposal. Disposal is not a fast thing. We can quickly contain and isolate and secure. It takes quite a bit longer to get rid of these things sometime and affect a complete disposal. So the on-scene coordinators, they stay around. They're there for the long haul until not only are the immediate threats mitigated, but the waste themselves are disposed. So the two images here, though, will also show that sometimes it's not just in our local vicinity, right? The image on the right is not in our region. That's Manhattan. But we did send on-scene coordinators to Manhattan. The image on the left is our folks, and what they're doing is they're sampling for anthrax spores in the Capitol buildings in Washington, D.C., when somebody thought it was an idea to send an envelope full of anthrax spores through the mail system in Washington, D.C. But sometimes our calls are kind of easily handled. Envision the oil spill in the remote area of West Virginia. Sometimes they're quite complex. Think of cleaning up all the anthrax spores in Washington, D.C. So if you advance to the next slide, that what I'd like to convey here, that is to make this work well, we spend quite a bit of time planning and preparing. No incident is alike. They're all very different. They have different challenges, different contaminants. They're affecting communities in vastly different ways. But we still want to have a general plan on how we're going to coordinate, a general idea of what types of tactics we can bring to that incident. So we routinely try to exercise and train with our response partners. I was happy to hear Joel mention that we had been into his community before, helping to train the local responders so that they could get to do their business with confidence. John mentioned the regional response team. There are organizations, the regional response team is one of them. I am the co-chair. I'm the EPA co-chair, along with my Coast Guard counterpart of the regional response team. And it's comprised of all of our states in Region 3 have a member. The key federal agencies have a member. And there are other response organizations that are also participants on a regional response team. And we meet and we try to best plan and prepare ourselves as a region to respond in your community. So in the very bottom right of my screen there, you'll see an image of our region further broken up into smaller areas. We do this so we can assign a smaller group of people to focus on smaller areas of the region. It's very hard for just a few people to get out and interact with an entire region. So we try to break it up to facilitate our outreach. And if you could advance the slide. The way we respond is this: we first assess and evaluate. That is the number one thing. You have to know what to do. So we collect information. We rely on people like Joel and John to help us out. And when we need more, we have specialized personnel and resources to collect additional information. We're trying to figure out what's there and what can be done. And if you advance the slide, this is kind of where we excel. We have a lot of resources. Dylan, if you advance the slide, we have a lot of resources to act. We can bring a lot to the table. We have given our on-scene coordinators the ability to bring resources with them to immediately start actions to mitigate. We can bring specialized equipment and specialized contractors to do kind of whatever needs to be done in these incidents. A classic example might be in an instance where you have that gasoline spill, where vapors might be a problem. Well, now make it more exotic than gasoline. It might be that the ability to monitor that is very specialized. So EPA can bring to an incident specialized monitoring equipment, try to figure out how extensive a vapor plume might go. And I'll advance now to the final slide, and just to show this. The wire diagram, the diagram on the screen is how these responses are all organized. There's a basic structure to how we try to organize ourselves once we are responding to an incident. You don't really have to remember all the boxes and what their functions really are, but right in the command stem of this diagram is public information. It's important to us. It's very important to us to be able to communicate outwards to the public, because the public needs to be informed. We believe an informed public, of course, it will be a more and better engaged public. There's also formal ways for information to come back into this organization through the liaison, for example. So public information is important to us. It's part of the structure. It's been part of the structure of how responders respond to these in these communities. It's been there from the beginning. It has grown. It has gotten more technically savvy over the years. But my intent here was to show you that the function has always been there. In an emergency, you might see the public information officer might be in something very small. It might be the fire chief, it might be the police chief, it might be Joel, right? For these local incidents. And as they escalate up, the state governments and the Commonwealth governments, the federal government, we have our own versions of these people to act as spokespersons for the agency. My personal opinion is it's better to have somebody more at the local level who might know the community the best, who might know many members of the community. So we're happy to support that person as they do their job. Traditionally, you'll see public meetings. John showed a great example. There's another one on the screen right now. This is very traditional. We'll have press events. You'll see the people drag the podium up and they'll talk to the cameras, right? We might deliver fact sheets when things get more stable and time avails itself. And my last bullet there is kind of like what's happening today. right? It's more common now to see that information is being passed around from an incident and back into an incident via the various social media platforms. And I'm not here to say that government agencies in general are the best at this, but I can say that we're trying to get better at that. And if you advance to the last slide, Dylan, it's just the end of the presentation with some nice pictures and the question mark. And the question mark is there for an opportunity for us to interact with the audience if there are questions about anything that we've said, if there's comments on things that we said, or if you want to relay some information to us that you think would be helpful. And Dylan, that's the end of the PPT, and I'll stop the sharing.
We are transitioning over to our question and answer session. For everybody that's in attendance of the session, please feel free to put any questions in the chat.
The question I see with respect to do we support tabletop exercising? I think the answer is we support all levels of exercising. We have tabletop exercising. We'll have basically just skill drills, just practicing one specific thing. And they go all the way up to full scale, roll everything out and train as if it's a real deal with everybody out in the field. It's really all levels of exercise. So I would support as much as we can do. I'll let either John or Joel chime in, but we often find that many members of the response community at the more local levels, they have day jobs, right? They have other things that they're responsible for. So we try to gear as necessary. We try to gear those types of things to the schedules that local communities might have, local responders might have, which might be weekends, for example.
Yeah, I can comment on the PGM level grid outage. I just recently attended a PEMA, Pennsylvania Emergency Management in-service training that had the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission conduct a tabletop exercise just on that topic. We exercised the Christmas event that just occurred this year. So I believe some of those tabletops probably in response to you know, how our power grid looked around the Christmas time frame are occurring. So there's most definitely an environmental annex to that, you know, to our water treatment systems and how that would look. So yes, I think that counties should start to think about exercising just that scenario. Thank you.
Dylan, monitoring the chat, I don't see another question or comment.
I don't see any. And look at that. We do have a question that came in from Russell. Does anyone have any advice on making reports to the National Response Center?
So I'll take that one only because I also happen to know what the Schuylkill River. So there's anybody can contact the National Response Center. It's not limited to any type of entity. So anybody can contact a National Response Center with either what they believe to be a release of a hazardous substance or a discharge of oil. We're hopeful that the responsible entity will be the person making that spill report. The goal of the report in the National Response Center is to make sure that an incident is reported to the agencies that might have interest in that report and might respond to that report. Look at it kind of as a federal level of a 911 or a dispatch center or a reporting center. Somebody reports information in and immediately gets spread out to those entities, inclusive of the state entities, inclusive of federal entities like Fish and Wildlife, for example, and the EPA, for example, who might have an interest in that spill.
Mike, if I could tag on to what you just said, the most appropriate route of notification is up through 911 call centers. And I say that because we have experience, and I see that we have we have an individual from MWCOG on this call, but for a well-known incident that occurred on the Potomac River, and there are several extremely important water intakes on the Potomac River, and it was a sheen event. And the notification went sort of to the top first, meaning that the entity reached across to EPA and said, hey, can you help us out? There's a sheen on the river. And EPA does did what EPA does, and that's to help out. But what ended up happening is they bypassed local response resources, which could have been out on the water in a very, very short time frame, putting out oil deflection boom to protect water intakes. So we always say start with 911. As Mike said at the beginning of all of these presentations, all incidents start at the local level. So it's appropriate to start at the bottom, and those notifications will make their way up to the appropriate levels as needed.
Thanks, John. We can get into the details of reportable quantities and requirements, but John's absolutely right. Starting local is always a good way to start. I saw other comments that came in. So the next one I saw was, I'm not sure I totally understand it, but do we reach the OSCs to help set up drills? Well, the answer is that if it's at the federal level with respect to EPA, if EPA can be helpful to a exercise or a training event that's being conducted in a state or a local jurisdiction, we're always helpful, always try to help it out. I mean, our group is kind of on the small side, so you're not going to find us at every single one of them, but we do a number of these. We do very many of these over the course of the year. Each of the regions that I showed on my colorful map has several people assigned to it, and part of their job responsibility is to be aware of exercises and trainings occurring in those areas, and if they need to, can they, or if they're asked to, they can participate in those exercises. So I guess as part of the making the slide decks available, we can also let the names of those persons in those smaller areas also be available. The general answer is yes. You can talk to the on-scene coordinators responsible for those areas to help participate in exercises, drills, and trainings. Next one I see on the screen here is discussing if and how equity and cumulative impacts are assessed. So I think there's two ways of looking at that specific question. One is in the pure response mode. So we are reacting, right? So when spill calls come in and events are occurring, we're reacting. So and at the very beginning, on moment one, the consideration for what this comment is getting to may not be the first thing thinking about. What we're thinking about is what's happened and what do I need to bring in terms of a technical resource. So, but among the soon after things to be considered, and this is probably gets most spun up and most, I guess, energized when the community really begins to interact, right? So when we go somewhere, at least I'm speaking federally now because we don't know all the communities. So we're reacting to technical information and what resources do we need to bring to there. But one of the resources that we bring, I mentioned on the very last slide, our ability to bring resources to interact with community, to engage with the community. We call them community involvement coordinators. They're available to our emergency responders. One of their roles can be to basically, I'm using the term interact, but it's to gather information about where we are. And part of that information can be what the commenter was talking about in are there cumulative type impacts for us to be worried about. Right, because what that could lead to is if the same thing has happened over and over and over again, it could lead to what is the problem that's occurring here and how can that problem be better affected? Which goes to the next comment I see with respect to the list, a list of facilities. So I'm going to lean a little bit on John and Joel here, but what I can say is that there are many facilities and there are different categories of facilities based upon what they have in storage, certain gallons, types of chemicals and those kinds of things. And those facilities are known. There's inspections, there's reporting requirements for those facilities, but there's not like a master list of every single facility in, EPA Region 3, but there are identifications of those facilities that have certain levels of chemicals and certain types of chemicals and certain volumes, for example. So, and I'll lean on Joel and or John to further enhance that answer.
Joel, if you want me to, I'll jump in first. If you wanted to speak to the petroleum world, depending on the facility, they're required, at least in our state, well, actually, and it's for underground storage tanks, the states implement federal regulations. So there are registration requirements for those, and that's anything from your local gas station to the underground storage tanks that store petroleum. It could be a federal facility, could be something that's not available to the public, but there are requirements to register those tanks, and that information, at least in Virginia, is available, and it's available online. You can look at all of the registered underground storage tank facilities in Virginia. You can do the same for above ground storage tanks. So this is, you think about those bulk fuel storage facilities, they also have to register their tanks, and we keep that information at the Virginia DEQ. And that information is also available if you want to look it up on, you can look it up on our externally facing GIS platform. When you start talking about chemical storage, that's the realm of the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, so EPCRA. They're, depending on what a facility stores, they are required to send the information concerning those chemicals, so what they're storing and what the quantities are, to the state emergency response commissions, the CERCs, by that acronym, and they hold that information. It's a federal program, but we hold the information, and upon request, we make that information available to local emergency planning committees. Because they're tasked, obviously, with developing chemical emergency response plans for their localities. It's not available widely to the public, and that's really out of a security concern. So the best way would be to engage with a local emergency planning committee if you had interest in what's in your community. Anything else you want to add, Joel?
No, you did a fine job of the EPRA, SARA Title III legislation, and there is some restrictions to that. There's some exemptions, at least in Pennsylvania, maybe, for agriculture, and Pennsylvania Labor and Industry has a part, at least here. I would say the commodity flow study, I know we're talking about fixed facilities, but on the local level, best practices is every 5 years conducting a commodity flow study where they look at traffic flow and specifically document the placards and what directions they're going to. So by doing those studies, you're able to get a better idea of your community and where petroleum is being delivered to. And there could be a facility that is just quite frankly exempt. And through that commodity flow, you identify that, might do a dashboard survey, drive down the road and see, oh, there's a facility there, and talk to the owner, have the local fire department come in and conduct some training on the local level. So that's just some of the things that we do on the local level. There's loopholes to it all, and as John alluded, some of it is able to be public knowledge, some is not, depending on the industry and what it looks like. But by all means, on the local level, we're relying on those local first responders to know what's in their area and to reach out to those facilities so they have a plan in place before an event occurs.
Okay. Well, what I want to say again to everybody is greatly appreciated. I hope the people that did have a question, that we provided an answer that will at least make it seem as if we answered your question. And if there's no further questions, Dylan, I think that on behalf of EPA, I just want to say thanks to everybody who joined us. Thanks again to John. Thanks again to Joel for helping out with this. Greatly appreciate it.